June 28, 2012. The air inside of Montreal's House of Jazz was thick with music and memories. Billy Georgette, a fixture of the city's jazz scene, was up on stage. His nimble fingers chased fireflies across the black and white keys of the club's grand piano. Billy had organized this night. It was an occasion for Montreal's musicians to gather once again and jam. There that night was pianist Oliver Jones, saxophonist Richard Paris and Leroy Mason, and drummer Norman Marshall Villeneuve. Each of these jazz icons had honed their talents in and around the clubs of Montreal's Little Burgundy neighborhood, and they gathered that night to pay tribute to one club in particular, Rockhead's Paradise, and to salute the men behind it. Rewind a century, when Rufus Rockhead immigrated to Montreal, at a time when the city wasn't a particularly inviting place for young men from Jamaica. Soon enough, Rufus found himself serving overseas as a member of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, a soldier in the First World War. As a veteran, he returned to find little had changed for Black men in Canada. The country was still plagued by systemic prejudice, but Rufus was a man undeterred by obstacles. He was highly business savvy and envisioned a Montreal where good times could be had by one and all, regardless of skin color. In 1928, Rufus bought a 3-story, red brick building located on the corner of Mountain and Saint-Antoine, in the heart of Montreal's Black community. This site would eventually become Rockhead's Paradise. It was 1930. Prohibition and racial segregation were still in effect in the United States. And just 60 kilometers from the US-Canada border, Rufus opened a nightclub where everyone was welcome to have a drink and hear some of the best music played anywhere in North America. For decades, Rockhead's Paradise was the Canadian destination for the biggest names in jazz. Names that included Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie, and Nina Simone. And while there, these acts would share the stage with Canadian talents like Oliver Jones and Oscar Peterson. For a time, Rufus saw no end in sight for Rockhead's Paradise, but forces outside his control were determined to pull the plug. He had to continually fight against institutional racism and political corruption, and he endured several attempts to shut his business down. It turned out that nurturing an oasis where culture and community could grow and thrive in the heart of La Métropole was uphill work. But through that uphill work, Rufus learned that success isn't just about where you end up. It's about how much you had to push through to get there. From Knockabout Media, I'm Cindy Charles, and this is The Black Hum, Season 2. In this episode, we're looking at the life and legacy of Rufus Rockhead. This is Episode 4, The Night's Most Important Men. Rufus Nathaniel Rockhead was born in 1896 in Maroontown, Jamaica, to parents John and Drusilla Rockhead. The Rockheads were direct descendants of the Jamaican Maroons, communities established by formerly enslaved Africans who had escaped British plantations and built independent settlements in Jamaica's interior. Through decades of armed resistance and guerrilla warfare, the Maroons forced the British colonial powers to sign treaties recognizing their freedom, land rights, and political autonomy. Even today, the Maroons assert treaty-based rights over land, customs, and local governance. Rufus Rockhead was born into this lineage, shaped by resistance, self-governance, and survival. In 1916, Rufus would make the long journey from Jamaica to Canada in search of greater opportunity. With the First World War consuming Europe and Canada fully committed to the fight, Rufus was able to find work in a Montreal munitions factory. As the war intensified, these factories ran day and night, working to keep up with Canada's industrial war machine. But soon, Canada would need more from Rufus.
At that point in time, the CEF needed soldiers.
This is historian Mathias Joost.
It didn't matter what your skin color was by this time. You had conscription, so everybody was being enlisted. Black, white, they wanted them all.
On January 29, 1918, Rufus Rockhead was conscripted into the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was deployed as a private with the 1st Quebec Regiment serving in France. He'd began his service as an infantryman, but soon was transferred to No. 8 Company.
As the front is moving, as the Western Allies are pushing the Germans back, the airfields had to be moved forward. And based upon what had happened in 1916-17, the Canadian Forestry Corps was asked to provide 5 companies, roughly about 175 men each, to go and provide this logistical support to go and rehabilitate airfields that the Germans had abandoned.
As we discussed in our episode on Charlie Kelly, as of August 1918, the Allies were deep into the 100 Days Offensive. It was an all-out campaign to break the German army and force an end to the war. Advancing toward Germany meant airstrips had to be brought closer to the front and made fully functional. That required reclaiming and rebuilding airfields the Germans had left behind, allowing aircraft to support troops on the ground. No. 8 was central to that work, restoring and upgrading these airfields. While the series has focused on the history of No. 2 Construction Battalion, No. 8 was also made up of mainly black soldiers. In fact, like Charlie Kelly, some of these soldiers had originally been with No. 2.
There were a total of 11 white soldiers, and most of them, except for 1 or 2, were in the leadership position. So they were the corporals, the sergeant, warrant officer. So the black soldiers were the ones that did the work, and the white, the few whites that there were the ones who were doing the supervising.
The 100 Days Offensive succeeded where years of stalemate had failed, pushing German forces into sustained collapse. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed by Germany and the Allied powers. The war had lasted more than 4 years and claimed the lives of roughly 16 to 20 million people worldwide. On that same day, November 11th, Rufus Rockhead was admitted to the 7th Canadian Stationary Hospital in Cagnes, France. He spent the next 60 days dealing with venereal disease. While unpleasant and somewhat embarrassing, VD was not uncommon among Canadian troops during the war.
I believe that the statistics are that somewhere in the neighborhood of over 60% of all Canadian soldiers overseas came down with venereal disease.
Most Canadian soldiers who contracted VD during the war did so while on leave overseas through sexual contact in the cities and towns surrounding Allied camps. But as Mathias points out, these statistics aren't related to some kind of prurient behavior unique to Canadian soldiers, but rather is indicative to the prudishness of the Canadian military senior command.
They didn't want to hand out condoms to the Canadian soldiers. The French did, the British did, but the Canadians, no, we will not give them condoms. They're not supposed to partake in these activities.
After recovering in the hospital, Rufus was officially discharged from the military in March of 1919. He earned a British War Medal and a Victory Medal for his service. He returned to Montreal and, like many veterans, began searching for his place in this new post-war reality. He first ran a shoeshine stand on the corner of St. Catherine and Peel Street, just outside Montreal's Grand Windsor Hotel. The Windsor was a meeting place for Montreal's elite, including executives of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Grand Trunk Railway. On a daily basis, Rufus was in the company of a level of power and wealth that he could only dream of at the time. He knew he couldn't get to where he wanted to be shining these men's shoes, so he made a switch. turning to one of the few good professions open to Black men in Canada at the time. He would go to work for the Canadian Pacific Railway as a sleeping car porter, but by design, it wasn't necessarily a desirable position with the railway.
And then around the turn of the century, the unions here, which were majority white members, deliberately voted to exclude the Black members from the union, even though they were doing the same jobs and were in multiple jobs at the time. And they basically squeezed out the Black man and isolated him in one particular position.
This is Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy is a professor at Concordia University in Montreal and specializes in Black history in Canada.
So he could no longer be a waiter or a conductor or any of the other, a brakeman or any of the other jobs that were open to fellow, I won't call them unionists, but co-workers, people that they were dealing with every single day. They were relegated to that one position, and that was dealing with the public. So they wound up becoming domestic workers, but on the train.
For 8 years, Rufus worked as a sleeping car porter, typically on the Montreal to Chicago route. This was during the Prohibition era in the United States, when the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages was against the law. Of course, this ban led to a growing demand for illicit alcohol south of our border. This gave Rufus an idea.
So he took advantage of the fact that the trains were running north and south, at least the ones he was on, and they were also later on going east and west. He saw an opportunity because Montreal was a wet city, meaning we had alcohol here at the time. They had to, for some of them that wanted to sustain family life and also to, to improve themselves or just to get to the basic level of agency, which means you have choices about things you want to do, and often each choice will have a price to it, and that means you've got to earn the money if you want to do them.
And business was good for a while. It is an often repeated legend that he ran shipments of Canadian whiskey for notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone. But Rufus's profitable run would end abruptly in 1927. On one journey from Montreal to Chicago, Rufus was tipped off that the police were waiting down the line at Windsor Station, ready to arrest him for trafficking. So, at the first chance he got, Rufus hopped off the train before it reached Windsor. He then laid low until the heat died down. But Rufus wasn't one to just sit still, even if he was in hiding. That same year, he married Elizabeth Weeks. Folks call her Birdie. The two had met at their local church. The couple would go on to have 3 children together, Kenneth, Jacqueline, and Arvella. With his bootlegging business behind him and still keeping a low profile, Rufus started to plan his next business endeavor. He saved his money from the railway and, more significantly, from bootlegging. He had managed to scrape together a decent war chest, and he wanted to open his own bar and nightclub. So, with that money, Rufus Rockhead, the Jamaican immigrant, the veteran, the porter, the bootlegger, was about to establish what would become a cornerstone in Montreal's emerging jazz scene.
I've got a secret, I've got a mind to tell. Suddenly, truth is I'm in love. Once blue and sullen, grown and muttering, now I'm fluttering like the wings of a dove.
At the end of the 19th century, there was a growing temperance movement in Canada. Like in the United States, there was a push to limit, if not totally ban, the production, distribution, and consumption of alcohol. These bans were enacted at various levels, including municipal, provincial, and national for a short time. The province of Quebec adopted prohibition briefly in 1919, before it was repealed in the face of intense public pressure. In all this time, Montreal remained a wet oasis within a dry continent.
And that definitely attracted people. And also the need or the desire for alcohol continued. It didn't abate just because there was prohibition.
Goodbye, Broadway. Hello, Montreal.
Montreal's status as a wet city was what initially facilitated Rufus Rockhead's entry into bootlegging. The city earned a reputation as the Paris of the North. It was a destination for thirsty travelers from Ontario and the States. With an influx of new dollars came cabarets and gambling halls and nightclubs, especially along Montreal's vibrant Saint Laurent Boulevard. When night fell on the city, rules became suggestions. The music was played loud, and the party never seemed to stop. Tourists poured into Montreal, and with them came jazz musicians.
They were able to get some of the best jazz musicians in Canada as well as the States to come over.
This is historian Kathy Grant. Kathy notes that the time was right for an ambitious Black entrepreneur to make his mark on the Montreal nightclub scene. As I said in the intro, it was in 1928 that Rufus bought that 3-story building at the corner of Mountain and Saint-Antoine. He transformed its first floor into a tavern and lunch counter. The second floor was a dining hall with a stage, and the top floor operated as a 15-room hotel. He called it Rockhead's Paradise. Rufus had built it, but if he wanted them to come, he'd need a liquor license. It turned out that the same politicians responsible for keeping Montreal a wet city weren't keen on a Black-owned nightclub. But Rufus Rockhead was not a man easily deterred. He had served during the Great War, hustled as a porter, amassed a tidy fortune as a bootlegger. He understood how the game was played. In order to make his dreams a reality, he had to grease palms and pull strings. He had to find the politicians who were friendly to Black business owners. But even with all his work behind the scenes, it still took Rufus 11 months to gain a permit just to sell beer. It was enough for the moment, and he opened Rockhead's Paradise in 1930. It would take him another 5 years of lobbying to obtain a liquor permit, but nevertheless, Rockhead's provided an experience unmatched in Montreal. This, again, is Dr. Dorothy Williams.
This was an after-hours experience that there were a lot of jamming sessions that went on that I think epitomized or reinforced in people's mind that jazz was special in Montreal. So his club attracted anybody, particularly the Black jazz performers, from Ella to Louis to all of them.
That's Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. As the decade rolled on, Rockhead's Paradise hit its stride. The world's greatest musicians considered the club a mandatory stop. Over the years, legends like Billie Holiday, Lead Belly, and Dizzy Gillespie all graced its second-floor stage.
They would come into Montreal, paid for by the downtown clubs, but in the after hours, when they finished their last set, that's not where they stayed.
As Black acts, these musicians could play the downtown venues, but they couldn't patronize them. Nor could they stay at the Windsor or the Mount Royal or the Ritz-Carlton. They had to find accommodations friendly to Black travelers.
That's not where they stayed. They weren't allowed to anyway. They would just get dressed and walk down the hill, literally, because it's south of everywhere. And they would go into Rufus Rockhead's and get a drink, perform, ad-lib, do what they want, and create really, really incredible jazz experience.
The club was the heartbeat of Montreal's Black community. Little Burgundy, the neighborhood, was dubbed Harlem of the North.
Unlike the downtown clubs that wouldn't let Black people in to hear Ella, they could go to Rufus and wait for her to come from her gig uptown and then hear her at 2 a.m, just playing away, singing, scatting, whatever. So it didn't matter. Those in the know enjoy for another 3-4 hours, till the sun came up and things shut down.
The club remained successful throughout the 30s and 40s. Here, again, is historian Kathy Grant.
A lot of the soldiers in the Second World War would go and visit Rockhead's Paradise because of the jazz, because of the entertainment that they had. They had women kind of like burlesque type dancers, and it was like a joyous time. Like only like the best musicians were able to play there.
And if you were a woman, Rufus would gift you with a carnation.
He made everybody feel special, everybody welcome. Didn't matter the color of their skin. They were coming and, being part of a moment.
But everything has its expiration date. As the 1950s dawned, a perfect storm of economic collapse, political ambition, and urban decay began to gather over Montreal. The Black community of Little Burgundy had for generations relied heavily on one industry, the railway. But the new decade brought a revolution in North American transportation. There was a rise in car ownership, and freight shipping shifted dramatically to trucks. Passenger rail, the source of so many Black livelihoods, was in steep decline. Rockhead's Paradise felt this decline through a vanishing clientele. But there was also a political element that would hurt the club. Conservative Premier Maurice Duplessis and Montreal mayoral candidate Jean Drapeau.
It allowed a mayoral candidate called Jean Drapeau to actually run on cleaning up the city, equating jazz, music, and that whole area or that whole entertainment sector with crime and corruption and contrary to good Catholic values.
Drapeau and Duplessis were both reformers, determined to scrub Montreal clean of its notorious reputation as a city of sin.
They won. The pushback was quite strong, quite real, and quite severe.
After becoming mayor, Drapeau launched a morality squad. It targeted the very elements that defined the city's nightlife, from brothels to gambling halls, but also nightclubs. Rufus Rockhead, who had already spent years convincing racist officials to grant him permits to run his business, now faced a new pair of highly motivated politicians. And it didn't take long before there was trouble in Paradise. The Duplessis government reportedly requested a political contribution from Rufus to the tune of $40,000, roughly $460,000 today. When Rufus offered half the amount, his club was hit with charges for staying open after hours, something they'd been doing for decades.
When they padlocked his nightclub one night and confiscated all of the alcohol, he had a liquor license, but that was controlled by the province, and they pulled his license and basically took all of his alcohol that he had without any compensation.
Rufus, who was usually one step ahead of the authorities, found himself caught off guard and without a plan of action. He elected to launch a silent protest.
So for the longest time, he would come and sit outside of his padlocked place and just basically saying to anybody that would listen that he wasn't going to pay under the table to try to get his license back. And he would wait until there was a change in the government because he felt at that point he would be treated equally as a citizen of the province and not have to pay fealty to the administration.
Rockhead's Paradise closed in 1953. The dawn of the 1960s spelled the end of the Duplessis era, which had been defined by its close ties to the Catholic Church, social conservatism, and limited civil liberties. The change in government that Rufus Rockhead anticipated had come, and it was time to reopen Paradise. The era of big band jazz had faded, replaced by R&B and soul music.
It's a different world. So he couldn't recreate a jazz club experience.
Rufus brought life back into the club by pivoting to this new, modern sound, and it experienced a new heyday as acts like Nina Simone graced the stage. While the infusion of new music reinvigorated the space, the neighborhood itself had not rebounded. As Rufus got older, he handed the reins over to his son, Kenneth, to manage the club. Little Burgundy, once a glittering hub of nightlife, was suffering from urban decay. Kenneth Rockhead eventually sold the property in 1980. The club continued, but the Rockhead family's ownership was over. The 3-story building Rufus bought decades earlier was eventually demolished.
It became a lot, then it became a parking lot, and my understanding is that it actually sold for $70 million. I think Rufus would have appreciated that lot, so that they could build a high-rise there, which become like one of the go-to places for people to be right across the street from the center of Montreal entertainment, which is the Bell Centre. So it's a very lucrative spot.
Rufus Rockhead died in 1981 at Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue Veterans Hospital. In 1989, Montreal acknowledged his lasting impact by memorializing him with a street and park bearing his name in Little Burgundy. At that 2012 session, dubbed Rockhead's Last Jam, pianist Billy Georgette said that the night's performance was dedicated to those at Rockheads who showed us the path, and though many may be forgotten, are so much a part of the city's rich cultural history. Long after the lights went out at Rockhead's Paradise, the music Rufus Rockhead helped set in motion never really stopped. In a city that once tried to keep him at the margins, his legacy still swings at the center, carried forward in every note played and every door he helped open. Next time on The Black Hum.
There were 75 men who drove to Oakville, dressed in white gowns and hoods, and torched a massive cross in the middle of a main street. And they all stood around in eerie silence as the cross burned down to the last ember. Their objective was to stop an interracial marriage as they defined it. Next, they drove to where the woman was living, and they took her from her home. And then they burned a second cross in front of that home and warned the African-Canadian man not to see the white woman again.
The Black Hum is an original production of Knockabout Media, hosted by Cindy Charles and written by Nuruddin Qorane. This series is executive produced by Ryan Barnett with associate producer Cindy Charles. It was made possible with funding from Veterans Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program. Voice direction by Sonia Gemmiti with sound design by Ryan Barnett. Additional research provided by Dr. Sarafina Pagnotta. This series features interviews with Stephen Dame, Robert Downey Jr., Jerome Downey, Dorothy Williams, Michael Marville, as well as our series consultants, Mathias, Joost, and Kathy Grant. Additional voices are provided by Keith Francis and Matthew Barnett. If you're an educator and wish to incorporate this podcast into your classroom, we have created a listening guide that can be found in the show notes or downloaded at knockaboutmedia.com.
A Knockabout Media original. Hold on.